my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker this morning, Mike Tipton, who is a well-renowned physiologist who looks at exercising at extreme. Now, you might say that's what to do with rowing, but I was sitting on Thursday night at the dinner talking to somebody about rowing on ice. So who knows, maybe what he's going to say will become relevant to us shortly. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Rosie and Sam and everybody else who's invited me to be here. You can be the judge of what I'm about to say is relevant, but hopefully somewhere in amongst what I'm going to say you may be able to use in one way or another. And because of that, I've decided I'm going to do a fairly quick general review of stuff that you'll probably know and end up with some of the other stuff that we're looking into and thinking about that just may raise a few issues. We come from the Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth, where we have lots of nice facilities that go between about -20 and +50. We can go to 8,000 metres, and we can get hot and cold. So we do lots of different work in that area. Originally really supporting groups like the oil industry, the National Lifeboat Institute, Surf Life Saving, the military. Then probably in the last 15 years looking more closely to helping some of the sports that have to go and perform in warm and hot and cold environments. So we kind of play on this continuum. We start with the elite performance, trying to maintain that. It's absolute fact that if you go into a hot or extremely cold environment, you're not going to improve your performance. It's all about trying to maintain it as close as possible to the elite level. And then perhaps at the other end, we're looking more at some of the occupational groups and some of the military that go into extreme environments where there is actually a survival risk. So let's start with a statement which is, I can tell you is true, that for a human subtropical, low-altitude, air-breathing animal, most of planet Earth represents a hostile place. We have this lovely image of a blue planet that we live on. In fact, we're confined to about 15% of its surface area, because that's not water or mountain or ice or desert. And so, as a tropical animal, we are already struggling because we've inhabited the rest of the planet away from our tropical origins. And we compound that by producing quite a lot of heat ourselves, between about 70 watts and 1.7 kilowatts, so almost a 2-bar fire when you're working flat out. Just to put that in perspective, if you prevent most of that heat, or nearly all of that heat, leaving the body, as you might do if you happen to be fighting in a biological chemical arena, then with moderate exercise, you'll reach heat stroke in about 25 minutes. So we'd expect a survival period of about 25 minutes in somebody working at a moderate level when they're not allowing any heat to escape from the body, about 4 hours if they're at rest. So that's another load that we impose upon ourselves. You'll be aware that in terms of physics, we exchange heat with the environment through conduction, convection, evaporation and radiation. And of course, as soon as the environmental temperature gets above mean skin temperature, we're actually taking heat on board by conduction, convection and radiation, and we're left simply with evaporation as our route of heat loss. There's the only model of temperature regulation I'm going to bore you with today. I quite like it because it informs us about our origins, because our vasomotor range, the temperature that we like to inhabit if we're lightly clothed or naked, is 26 to 30 degrees, and that's because that's where we evolved. And because of our intellect and our ability to technologically to build things, we've managed to inhabit the rest of the planet. We haven't done it by adapting our autonomic responses to heat and cold. We've done it through intellect, which is why on a frosty morning you can sit in Marlow and listen to me talk about it. It's not because you've adapted to cold, it's because you're sitting there covered in clothes and in a warm environment. In fact, you can even go up to places like Birmingham and do things. I come from Portsmouth, so I'm going the other way. If you get cold, you start to shiver. Shivering maximally is about 40% of your VO2 max. Will produce about 600 watts of heat. As you get hot, you start to sweat, obviously. Sweating at about 2 litres per hour maximum for a human. which is about 1,300 watts of heat loss. So you can actually start to do the calculation about whether the heat you're producing through the exercise we saw earlier, 1.7 kilowatts, 1,700 watts, when you're going to go into an uncompensable state, i.e. you're not going to be able to lose the heat you're producing and your deep body temperature is going to start to increase. That's just to emphasize the importance of evaporation when you're in a warm environment. A lovely experiment done by Blagdon before they had ethics committees. The dramatic illustration of the cooling effects of evaporation of sweat can be seen in the experiment of Blagdon, 1775, in which men remained for a period of 15 minutes in the dry atmosphere of an oven at 120 degrees Celsius without suffering ill effects, while a steak on an adjacent shelf in the oven was cooked. It's a lovely experiment which concluded with lunch, which is the kind of experiments I enjoy. I always ask people what's the most important word in that paragraph, and if they're students they always say steak, but in fact it's dry. It's because it's dry, and of course that enables you to evaporate the sweat you produce, and in so doing the latent heat of vaporization cools the body. That doesn't happen in humid environments. So that's the impact of skin and deep body temperatures on the body, and we start at the top with skin temperature, 42 degrees plus, burns coming through hot, comfort 28, 33, cool discomfort 25, 28, 20 degrees impaired dexterity, pain down at 15 degrees Celsius, numb at 10, non-freezing cold injury, which I suspect every rower that you've ever met has got, will have around about 5 degrees, and then human tissue freezes at about minus 0.5 degrees Celsius, and that's frostbite, which you will have heard of. In terms of deep body temperature, we live around about 37 degrees Celsius, heat stroke and death up at around about 40, 44, and profound hypothermia and death at 25, although that's much more variable. I was talking yesterday to Anna Bagenholm, the Norwegian skier who went through the ice, core temperature of 13.7 when she was admitted to hospital, and she's still 100%, although she is an anaesthetist, so I can't completely tell. There's the non-thermal factors that influence thermoregulation. We do a lot with survival in the sea and people saying, how long will they survive? You'll have heard of the cheeky Rafiki, and a very sad accident that occurred over the summer with the 4 guys bringing the boat back, and then the US Navy suspended the search and then restarted it because David Cameron and everyone signed a petition. It's very, very hard to say how quickly people will heat up and cool down, and it's because of some of those factors on that slide, which I don't have the time to go through today, but just to let you know that you are trying to individualise as best you can the advice you give to people because of some of those factors. Right, that's a general background on thermoregulation. Now just a couple of bits and pieces on performance in the cold. Hypothermia, not something you need to worry about, provided people are reasonably well protected, they don't get exhausted and they don't get injured, then you won't get hypothermia. Hypothermia that we see in cold environments nearly always is associated with starvation, exhaustion or injury, when people stop producing heat, because provided you're producing heat, you will stay warm. So I don't really see that as something we need to go into for this particular audience. Excuse me. Of course, the body protects against hypothermia by shutting down the extremity blood flow, and it will sacrifice the hands and feet in order to move the blood below the layer of subcutaneous fat, which has the same thermal characteristics as cork, and in so doing insulate the important internal organs. In fact, in terms of thermoregulatory responses, they're driven about 5 to 10 times more by deep body temperature than by skin temperature. And that's why we end up with things like freezing and non-freezing cold injury. Tend to look worse than it is, but that's Rand Fiennes' left hand. We were working with him when he was trying to walk to the North Pole some years ago, and his radio went through the ice. He had to go in and pick it up, and picked up a frostbite. He apologised for having dropped out of the experiment as a consequence of that. And you've heard the story, so you realise that these here are the saw marks where he was getting fed up with the bone getting caught in his clothing. Most people with frostbite will very quickly it be recommended to them that they have amputation because it looks much worse than it is. 3 months later, as long as you haven't got a local infection, then the tissues will auto-amputate and you end up with more tissue, and that's what's happened with Rand, thankfully. Non-freezing cold injury on the other side, as it says on the packet, is an injury to the tissues that can be as severe as frostbite, but without any freezing. It's just long-term vasoconstriction of the periphery. And I suspect that if I, as I say, did a test of cold sensitivity and everybody in this room and anybody who's ever rode, you'd come out as moderately severely cold injured, non-freezing cold injury. Females suffer more than males in this regard because estrogen upregulates the alpha adrenal receptors, so females shut down quicker when they go into a cold environment. They stay shut down longer, and they don't rewarm as well. So that's why females have cold hands and feet. In fact, one of the differential diagnoses we use for Royal Marines to see if they've got a cold injury is if their wife complains that they have cold feet in bed, because that's a complete reversal of the normal story, and it's a fairly good indication that they've got a peripheral neuropathy. In terms of performance in the heat and cold, because of the increase in deep body temperature seen during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, females do worse in the heat in the luteal compared to the follicular phase, and do better in the cold in the luteal compared to the follicular phase, simply because they're regulating off a higher or lower temperature. Where things might become more relevant to the rowing community is with the effect of superficial cooling. Once the cold has cooled the skin, the next tissues it cools are the superficial nerves and muscles, and that can lead to physical incapacitation. Below a temperature of about 20 degrees Celsius, the rate of conduction and amplitude of the neural responses, action potentials, is slowed, and power output falls by about 3% per degree C fall in muscle temperature. There's a whole host of reasons why muscle doesn't function very well when it drops below about 27 degrees Celsius. And this can happen long before deep body temperature gets to levels where you'd be worried. We tend to be a bit preoccupied with hypothermia, but most incapacitations that we see in cold environments, and cold water and cold air, are caused by the incapacitation of the peripheral musculature and neuromuscular function. Let's show you a quick example of that. This is a Royal Marine who's been in the water for 20 minutes. His core temperature is normal. It's an old video, so I apologise for the quality. His grip strength is reduced by about half. The cameraman's been drinking, so it's not quite in focus. And then, this is my colleague Frank Golden of many years. He's then asked just to do something simple, like open a flare. He can do this in about 10 seconds normally, but the problem here is, although his deep body temperature is normal, his forearm musculature, which is controlling his fingers, has cooled. All the joints are cold. The fluid in the joints is cold. He's lost the ability to oppose finger and thumb. Speed of movement's gone. And plastic represents a fairly significant challenge when it gets cold and wet. So there's another side of that equation, which is, you know, how you design equipment to be used in this situation. This goes on an awfully long while, so I'm going to cut it. But he, at one stage, well, you'll see in a minute, he gives up and tries to use his teeth. And there have been teeth found in life rafts in the Estonia incident, where people couldn't break into the balers to empty the life raft. And so there he goes there. And this is just about 20 minutes of exposure to cold. So you know this. People who have been involved in rowing, you know that you get cold hands if you can no longer grip. And it's really important, if you're going to maintain that function, to try and maintain torso temperature, upper arm temperature is really important. But the only way you're going to keep that function is by keeping blood flow going to the extremities. That's the major source of heat for a hand or a foot, is the blood flow that goes into it, rather than trying to insulate it particularly. It was about now he wanted to know the name and address of the guy who designed the flare packaging. So I can't, it's just too painful to watch. So the other thing, that as muscle cools, the blood flow to it cools. Is reduced. So you can see an example there from the excellent work of Rennie. Muscle blood flow is reduced at all levels of activity with decreasing muscle temperature. And that means that you have to switch to anaerobic metabolism sooner. So at a given submaximal level of exercise, you'll be using more oxygen, but your maximum oxygen consumption is reduced because of a limitation on blood flow, and your threshold for switching to lactate and anaerobic metabolism is moved to a lower workload. So there's good reasons for keeping the body warm and blood flow going to the extremities. Quick review of heat. How am I doing? Oh, not too bad. the direct effect of heat. Heat kills people. We know this is the US football players and US Marine recruits that have died, plotted on this graph against temperature. And it's not just a matter of being in a hot air environment. Of course, because of what I said earlier, there's also deaths occur when people are in humid environments that are down at around about 18 or 19 degrees Celsius. And it just doesn't happen to people in America who are playing football and in the recruits. It also, as you know from fairly tragic recent accidents, has occurred in the UK. There's the classic signs of heat disorders, starting with muscle cramps, heat exhaustion, probably more relevant to you than going on through to heat stroke. In general, I don't think this is a big problem for rowing, provided you understand the ways of mitigating these problems, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you understand the signs and symptoms of thirst, profuse sweating, fatigue, pale, when the skin starts to go pale. These are all indications of people progressing from normal hypothermic temperatures at which you exercise through to things where heat exhaustion and heat stroke may be a problem. And the reason this is probably more relevant than cold is because if you have a look at the wet bulb globe temperature, which is the way you should assess the environment, there's no point in just doing it by measuring an air temperature, because the air temperature won't tell you very much about the radiant heat, which is quite high out there today. It's going to make it quite comfortable at midday, but you wait until the sun goes down and it'll be freezing again. So you need to look at the wet bulb globe temperature. And when you do that for the Olympics going back through time to Los Angeles, you can see there the estimated heat stress associated with those environments. London was low, Sydney was low, Rio is expected to be high as opposed to very high. So there's the possibility. So you're preparing for the worst in a southern hemisphere winter and hoping for the best. But at 28, 30 degrees, 60, 70% humidity is the estimation. We did some modelling. Because you know how much body heat can be lost, you can calculate that. You can calculate the heat production. That's the estimated increase in the deep body temperature of rowers with time when they're producing anything between 250 and 500 watts. And we can do that for different environments. It's just an example of the mathematical modelling you can do of thermoregulation, making some assumptions about the physiological responses and doing the calculations on the physical heat exchanges. And as you can see, you would expect somebody going at 500 watts to get up to about 42 degrees in about 20 minutes, but hopefully they're finished by then. So for rowing, this was prior to, I think it was Athens, we concluded that they were unlikely to reach performance-limiting heat load. Prior warm-up profile didn't change its conclusion. So I don't think... Oh yes, there's a couple more. No active cooling required. Use of cooling vest post event is sexy but unnecessary. Acclimation strategy they had in place, and rehydration policies were in place. So actually, rowing were, as you might expect from first-class organisation, in good shape, better than some, I would say, prior to the Athens and Beijing Olympics. We're yet to see what's going on about Rio. So I don't think the direct effect of heat is a big problem for rowers. I think perhaps the indirect effect of heat, unless it's on things like training camps, and also if people have to spend time on water or near water before their event, perhaps the indirect effects of heat, because as I've already alluded to, that there's a big change in blood flow. You vasoconstrict to almost no skin blood flow, half a litre, 200 mils a minute in the cold, but then it goes very, very high when you get hot. So maximum vasodilatation, you're talking of greater than 5 litres per minute of blood flow. Now, obviously, that blood flow has got to be directed from somewhere else, and it tends to be directed from the viscera, and if possible from the muscle. If you add exercise to that, you now have that competition between skin blood flow and muscle blood flow that can compromise muscle blood flow and therefore performance. And that's just another slide to show the effect of exercise in the heat, with decreasing cardiac output, increasing heart rate, decreasing stroke volume. So all the things you'd expect from a cardiac function of something that's essentially not having enough fluid return to the system because it's going out to the extremities and to the skin to act as a thermoregulatory mechanism. Okay. Can I just take the next slide, please? go. And so that compromise in circulatory capability can lead to compromised muscle and liver blood flow, earlier onset of anaerobic metabolism, as I've said, and an increased glycogen usage, because as you know, if you're working anaerobically, your sole source of substrate is going to be glycogen. So we would expect to see glycogen depletion at an earlier stage when people are exercising in the heat compared to cold environments. Ideal environment for long-term aerobic exercise is around about 10 or 11 degrees Celsius. So I'm essentially summarising there. Sweating, dehydration, associated with vasodilatation, leads to cardiovascular insufficiency and impaired performance. How do you mitigate that? Now, again, time won't allow me to go through each one of these in time, in any depth, but you can see heat acclimatisation is mentioned a few times there, so we'll mention that in a moment. Maintaining hydration, I'm not going to talk about, because you can read about that and you'll hear about that all over the place. Adjusting pacing is quite an interesting one that most athletes don't want to hear about, i.e. slow up, so you don't produce as much heat. But you can be smart in longer distance events about how you go about pacing your activity to keep your body temperature compensable in terms of heat production against heat loss. And we've seen that happen in things like Olympic marathon distance events, where people start slow and gradually get fast. And it doesn't matter in the last half an hour if your body temperature is screaming up uncontrollably, because you're going to finish before it gets to those heat illness symptoms. So one of the areas that, again, we talk about quite a lot, but nobody's actually prepared to do very much about, is selection. There's a whole host of factors, and I'm not going to, again, go through them. They're on that slide. There are a whole host of factors that make people more or less susceptible to the heat. But how many people involved in coaching would actually deselect somebody from a team because they don't appear to be very good at performing in the heat? You'll try and do something about it. Now, we have a significant problem with things like football. Talking to the FA prior to the Brazilian World Cup, you see, our definition of a good footballer is somebody who can run about for 90 minutes, produce lots of heat in Manchester or Liverpool where it's cold and wet. Now try and do the same thing in somewhere that's warm and humid. You just can't play the game in that way. You have to change the way you go about things. But how do you do that when you don't know who the good players at playing that way are? So there's a whole issue to do with the way you approach performance in the heat. And there are undoubtedly individual variabilities from both genetic and due to environmental influences in the way people will respond, tolerate, and psychologically adjust to heat. Changes with acclimatisation to heat are on this slide. You should be aware of what they are, because you will have engaged in heat acclimatisation protocols in the past, and they can be summarised as improved salt balance, greater cardiovascular stability, better thermoregulation, improved work capacity, and carbohydrate sparing. That follows from the things I've just said, and particularly the underpinning improvement in salt retention and expansion of plasma volume is pretty key to many of those changes, as well as local sweat gland function. People often ask me, how do I know when somebody's heat acclimatised? Well, there's some of the markers of heat acclimatisation. I'm sure you've used some of these: heart rate, deep body temperature, thermal comfort, aldosterone levels, sweat onset, sweat production, potassium, sodium, concentration of the sweat halves over the course of a acclimatisation period. There's just one example. So this is from some nice work by Cohen and Gisolfi, which we've reviewed in that chapter here. So there's pre-training. That's the effect of training. This is core temperature. This is time in hours in terms of performance. And there's heat acclimatisation with exercise. And you see a very similar model or profile with heart rate. So you can use heart rate as a marker of what's going on. If you give people a standardised test, it's really important to give them a standardised test as their assessment before their acclimatisation, at the end of it, and you should be able to see those kind of changes as a marker of the level of acclimatisation they've achieved. How do you go about doing it? Well, we used to just put people in the heat and then they would get better. But of course what happens is, as they get better, the stimulus to adapt reduces. So another way of doing it is to get them to exercise to the same heart rate, or get them to exercise to the same deep body temperature. And what that will mean is as their cardiovascular system gets better, as their thermoregulatory system gets better, they will have to work harder and harder to go to the same heart rate or the same core temperature. So that's what we would now call controlled hypothermia, as opposed to a constant work, because now you're maintaining the stimulus to adapt. So just a quick summary for those that are interested in heat acclimatization. You have to raise the body temperature, you have to stimulate sweating, you need about 100 minutes a day at representative temperatures. If you're going to be going into a warm, humid environment, you need to acclimatize to that environment. A hot, dry won't do it for you. I say it's important to exercise. 10 to 14 days is the classic idea of how long it takes. No more than 3 days between sequential exposures. And you'll see 60 to 75% of the changes in 4 to 6 days. I'll mention that in a moment. Fitter individuals acclimatise more quickly, but even the fit people need to exercise in a warm environment. And on return to a temperate environment, you lose about 75% of your heat acclimatisation in about 3 weeks. I mean, that's answering all the frequently asked questions I get about heat acclimatisation on one slide. You'll get copies of the slides, you'll be relieved to hear. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to go through some other stuff. And this is, because all of that I would expect you as elite coaches to have a pretty good handle on. If you haven't, then I can give you, obviously, some references and talk to you about those areas. So here's some quick other stuff that you may have an interest in and might stimulate some discussion. If you look at this paper by Hessemer, which again we've reviewed in the chapter with my friends from America, if you look at exposure days, they showed that actually, we talked just now about 10 to 14 days of heat exposure for acclimatization. You can actually get that acclimatization in as short as 5 days. So you're seeing a sweating starting at a lower deep body temperature, the vasodilatory response occurring at a lower temperature. These are all beneficial if you're exercising the heat. The other interesting thing is that shivering starts at a lower temperature. So you've shifted the whole of the thermoregulatory system down. And that's quite a nice piece of work. It was the first piece of work to show a short-term adaptation. It also shows cross-adaptation between one side of the thermoregulatory system and the other. Much more recently, Garrett has confirmed that result and showed that you can get an increase in plasma volume expansion, and that increase may be slightly bigger if you allow people to acclimatise just 5 days, but with permissive dehydration. So you allow them dehydrate, which ends up being a bigger stimulus to expand the plasma volume, which is obviously a beneficial result. So they had increased plasma volume expansion, and they reduced thermal strain, and 2-kilometre rowing performance was improved by 4 seconds by this particular procedure. Cross-adaptation. Some of the adaptation that you see when you put people into an environment is generic. It changes in the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, cardiovascular changes, and others are specific. Heat, for example, is a specific change with the sweat glands. We've been quite interested. There's only about 40 studies ever been done on adaptation to one environment to another. And we're particularly interested in this for the military, of course, who go somewhere where it happens to be hot, but it also happens to be have altitude. So it begs the question, can you see cross-adaptation? And just recently we've published papers showing that actually if you cold habituate people, for those reasons I've just said, the changes in the generic aspects of the body, it improves their performance at altitude. So cold acclimatization improves people's performance at altitude. Now that begs the question, if you want to perform in the cool, what does heat acclimatization do for you? Well, actually, we've seen Lorenzo's work, this is Mike Sawker again out in the States, that actually heat acclimatization is not something you necessarily just want to do when you've got people going to perform in the heat, because heat acclimatization can also improve your performance in a cool environment. Increase VO2 max by 5% in the cool, power output 5%, time trial performance 6%. So that's a heat acclimatization protocol being used for people who are going to perform in a cool environment and having a beneficial effect. Menthol. We've played a bit with menthol. If you look at the cold receptors in the skin, there's a whole range of them now in terms of their different kinds of responses. And actually some of those responses, I already mentioned, the TRPM8 receptor, which is a cold receptor, is also stimulated by menthol. So what about if I spray the body in menthol? Can I make people feel better and work harder? Is that a really dangerous thing to do? Possibly. And so, sure enough, if you stimulate the cold receptors of the body of somebody exercising in the heat, they will get a response that is as equivalent to them being in a slightly cooler environment, and they will feel slightly better. If you combine that menthol with ethanol, then you'll get more evaporative heat loss as well. So you've now enhanced evaporative heat loss, and you've also stimulated cold receptors, so people feel better than they are. Not potentially, as you can imagine, a dangerous thing to do, but in a short-term event may actually make people remove some of that central limitation on your performance caused by increased body temperature. Last one, psychological skills training. You know that psychologists, sports psychologists, engage in giving people psychological skills training to improve their ability to do discrete skills like basketball shots. And they use goal setting, arousal regulation, positive self-talk and mental imagery. And I thought, well, we thought that this is interesting. I wonder if that skill set also applies to a thermal environment. And so we've done tests over the last few years looking at whether we could extend people's breath hold time going into cold water by giving them these 1 week of psychological skills training. And we found, absolutely, you can double somebody's breath hold time in cold water by not putting them anywhere near the water, but giving them some psychological skills training. What about in the heat? So this is a study that you can read. It's published, as the one I just mentioned. This is a control group doing a 90-minute run without any 3 times, without any psychological skills intervention. And this is the psychological intervention group, or PIG, as we unfortunately called it, which is, there's their first one, there's their second one, there's their psychological skills training, there's their run in the heat, 1.15 kilometres further. And these are accomplished runners by actually, and where this works, it works best in situations where there is a conscious component in your performance. So if you measure their heart rate response, it doesn't change very much on going into cold water. If you measure their breath hold time, it does, because there's a conscious component in that. When you run, the pace you set is dependent on a whole host of feedback that comes to you, and if you've managed to suppress some of that negative feedback, you can release your performance. And that's what we think psychological skills training does. This is a question I get quite a lot, so I'll end on it. Should you take the poor guy who's just done this terribly intensive session and now make him do something that we would normally regard as, potentially lethal? So you put them into iced water. There's a whole raft of reasons why this may work or may not work, and I've watched it going on for a long while now, and there are positives and negatives. If you look across the literature, there are some that say it's beneficial, and there's some that say it's not beneficial. There's some that say it's beneficial because people think it's beneficial, therefore it's beneficial, which is quite a lot of the thing that you play with elite athletes, isn't it? If you actually look at the detail of it, there's incredibly variable results because of methodologies. It's unclear if there's any beneficial effects other than the ones I've mentioned. Also, most of the experiments haven't controlled for the hydrostatic squeeze, for cold without the hydrostatic squeeze. It's absolutely clear that it may not be better than active recovery. Ice water is probably not necessary. Cool water that vasoconstricts would be good. Some of the protocols can't cool muscle. 3 times 1 minute won't cool muscle. We've done studies with looking at muscle temperature on that kind of thing. The potentially negative aspects of it, muscle function, and also non-freezing cold injury, have largely been ignored by those people who propose it. Cold water immersion post-exercise may aid some aspects of recovery in tournament-style events consisting of intermittent load-bearing exercise. That seems to be the message that's coming out. Otherwise, it may not be of any particular use, but it's certainly a stressful way to end your session. Finally, if you want to cool people, that's how you do it. Don't bother with necessarily ice vests or air perfused vests. Use a big fan, set up a cooling station, and if that doesn't work, or if they've got to wear clothing for some other reason, hand immersion, excellent way of cooling people. The body, because I said it's driven by its core temperature, will keep sending blood to the skin. Whilst it's hot, put it into cold water. You can lose about a degree and a half in about 20 minutes of deep body temperature, from 39.5, 38.5, 39 down to about 37, just by sticking the hands in cold water. There's the proof. There's Chris Hoy and Bradley Wiggins doing it in Athens. And the great thing about that was the Australians saw them doing it. Any Australians here before I say this? Ah, okay, only two, we can manage two. The Australians saw this and bought exactly the same stuff, did exactly the same thing, but they didn't put any water in the bags, which was great. In terms of the maintenance of performance in hot and cold environments, it is the indirect and peripheral rather than direct effects of temperature that have to be considered first and are probably more relevant for you guys. Neuromuscular function in the cold, cardiovascular function in the heat. Elite athletes are not normal. You need to customise their heat acclimatisation programs, all the stuff you do with them for the particular individual, allowing for that variability that I've described. That was a really fast tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks very much for your attention. If you want to read anything, I don't know if you guys are into, you must be researchers, into ResearchGate. Go on to ResearchGate, and everything I've said is there, and it's particularly beneficial for reading chapters, I find, because you can't get those any other way. So if you go on to ResearchGate, you can have a look at the background work and published studies of everything I've just said. Thanks again. I've told you everything I know, so be very careful.
Great lecture. I could ask a lot of questions, but I'll ask one. The permissive dehydration aspect, because I'm an old Texas boy, and back then you weren't allowed to drink too much water. You were supposed to suffer. And now we've gotten much better at keeping our athletes hydrated basically constantly. Are we diminishing the signal for adaptation with this, with our modern access to everything?
I mean, the general consensus at the moment would be, yeah, if you're trying to get a plasma volume expansion, then I mean, I see it in the same way as I kind of see glycogen loading, in that if you deprive the muscle of glycogen and then you give it glycogen, it'll overfill. And it seems to be something similar is happening with dehydration. So if you use heat acclimatization with permissive dehydration, you may. We're actually currently looking at that with a PhD student. So I don't know the definitive answer, but certainly that which has been published suggests exactly as you say. But it's important to say this is for specifically heat acclimatization. This is not something you would do as a general measure. You know, have people chronically dehydrated. It's just as part of your heat acclimatization exposure.
I'm not sure whether to describe your presentation as really hot stuff or really cool, but somewhere in between. I have read somewhere that the military avoid working their men or women intensively in very low temperatures because they're likely to die. And I've often speculated whether this is something to do with the condensed water evaporating from their skin, or in the light of what you've just said, some other physiological mechanism. I'd be interested to hear your comments, please.
Yeah, well, you'll be aware if you look at just quickly, the WBGT gives you limits for upper and going out in there. In the lower levels, temperatures, the exposure limits are almost all 100% determined by risk of frostbite, risk of freezing cold injury, rather than anything else. We could talk quite a lot about the potential of exercising in a cold environment, getting cold wind on the face, and what we would call autonomic conflict and sudden cardiac death, which is an area that we've been doing quite a lot of work in recently. But actually, in terms of the military, whether they go out in somewhere like Norway or they stay in, is pretty much driven by wind chill factor and frostbite risk.
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. In terms of rowing, we have high sweat rates at all, so maybe we are preconditioned to dehydration every training, and that's lead me to the first question: what does training induce in adaptation?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, sodium chloride storage. Mm-hmm. And acclimatization.
Okay, so it probably passed at about 100 miles an hour, but there was a slide there which talked about, you know, an essential change during the heat acclimatization process is the retention of salt. So sweat will go down from about 50 millimolars down to about 25 over. So you're retaining about half the sweat that you would normally lose prior to heat acclimatization, and that's the basic model that then expands the plasma volume that helps with the cardiovascular system. And basically, I mean, blood in this case, when we talk about heat, is essentially a coolant. We regard it as a coolant, picking up heat somewhere and delivering it somewhere else. So that's the sodium story. And there has been work that looks at trying to do almost the same with permissive salt intake and the consequence changes in plasma volume. It seems it's better to do it with fluid than it is with salt. Yeah, absolutely. If you've got somebody who's very fit and does lots of exercise, they will be somewhere between, in that 10 to 14 day heat acclimatization profile, they'll be somewhere at 5 to 7 when they start. So they have an advantage. Fitness, absolutely. And there's a, when you look at the heat acclimatization end results, quite a few of those are achieved by having high aerobic fitness, but not all of them. In order to absolutely maximize your ability to perform in the heat, you need to have exercised in the heat, as opposed to just exercised. And you can't even achieve it by having been in the heat without exercising. There's studies been done on saunas and hot baths. It's that combination that you need for the thermal and the cardiovascular drive to change. I shall be around for a bit, so by all means, catch me at the break. I'm conscious we're running. Thank you.